All right, we're going to go back to our story. All summer long, we've been reading a story together. And the story is found in the Bible. It's called the Acts of the Apostles. So this summer, I really haven't been preaching much. I've simply been giving background material, some context, and really letting the story speak for itself. But a quick recap, though, if you haven't been with us along the way, just to where we're at so far in our story before we go on with it. It starts with Jesus. As he leaves the disciples, he promises that he will give them power and commissions them to be his witnesses. And we hear the story of that, of how the Holy Spirit comes upon them, transforms this group of disciples into a community of people, and how this community is shaped by their care and love for one another. And they're known as the people of the way of love and compassion, the way of Jesus. It's not long, though, before persecution starts. When Stephen is killed, the people are scattered, and God reveals a much larger plan as they scatter all around the area, that this is not just a reformation of a Jewish tradition. This is, talks to Peter, reveals to Peter, this is a breaking down of the boundaries that have separated us. There's no longer going to be Jew or Gentile, clean or unclean. God's love is for all people. And one of the people who had sort of a conversion experience in the midst of this was someone named Paul. His name was Saul or Paul, we know him by both names. He has this powerful experience of experiencing of Jesus, and then changes his life, and then he disappears for a decade. Right? He goes off by himself. We don't hear about him for 10 years. Has this powerful experience, and then he needs to understand, what does this mean before I really share this with other people? Meanwhile, back in Palestine, the gospel is spreading out. With the being persecuted, people have spread out. They go farther and farther out from Jerusalem until they finally get up to Antioch, which is this major urban center, and it's here that becomes sort of the new center for Christian life. All right, and Antioch is where all of a sudden they're no longer just another way of being Jews. They recognize that there's something different, and they call themselves for the first time Christians, followers of Christ. And so for the rest of our book of Acts, it's really going to be centered out of Antioch and out of the missionary journeys from the church in Antioch for the second half of the book here. So in timeline, it's been about 15 years since the time of Jesus' death and resurrection. So for 15 years, the disciples have been expanding out a little farther, a little farther. And now out of Antioch, they're sending out a mission team. All right, and it's Barnabas and Saul are chosen. Barnabas has long been one of the disciples. He's the one who vouches for Saul. When it's time now, after 10 years, he goes and gets Saul and says, Saul, now it's time for you to go to work. And he finds him and brings him into the community, and they are sent out together now. So the first stop, and if you were here with us on Wednesday, we read this part of the story on Wednesday. The first stop that they leave and they go from Antioch is to go down to Cyprus. And say, well, why board a boat and go to Cyprus? Well, that's where Barnabas was from. He goes to his home country, his home people, to bring the word there. But then they move on from there. They go on up to what we call Asia Minor, or today we call it Turkey. And they make a surprising move. The Romans had built wonderful roads and highways that they could follow on to move. The Romans built them to move troops and supplies and things like that. But instead of following the nice Roman roads along the coastline, they decide to cross this big mountain range up there. So they cross this huge mountain range. And they go up to a town called Antioch. Different Antioch, but there was a king named Antiochus. And he was pretty famous, and so they named little towns after him all over the place. So there's Antiochs all over the place. And so they go up to Antioch up here. And they start visiting the synagogues. And people are interested. They said, what is this that you're saying? Tell us more about this. But then eventually conflict arises, and there's a riot, and they're forced to leave town. And so they head out of town. They head down the road, out of the mountains, down onto the plains of Anatolia to a town called Iconium. Now, this is not a big commercial kind of town. This is out in farmland. And it's not so much a Jewish community, not even Greek. It's more just the locals that had lived in that part of the world for centuries. Now, they're about halfway through what's going to be a 3-year journey that they've been taking. So that's get you up to speed. That's where we've gotten so far. So let me pick up here. This is chapter 13 here. It says, the same thing happened in Iconium. So when they mean the same thing, they mean the same thing where they went to the synagogues, and people started hearing, and then they had resistance come up. So same thing happened in Iconium when Paul and Barnabas went to the Jewish synagogue. They spoke in such a way that great numbers of both Jews and Greeks became believers. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who testified to the word of grace by granting signs and wonders to be done through them. But the residents of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Jews and Gentiles with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, the disciples learned of it, and they fled. They fled to Lystra and to Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, the surrounding country. And there they continued to proclaim the good news. All right, so we see this pattern repeating from the last chapter before. They start out by speaking to Jewish people. They find people who already have faith. They're not preaching a different God. They're preaching the same God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the God of David, of Moses. And so they're preaching the same God. They share a common experience. They have the same language they can share. But they have good news, they say, of a changing relationship, a different way in which they can grow in this relationship with God. An experience of grace and love for all people. If someone wasn't ready to hear that word, then they say, no problem, we'll go on to the next town. Our job is to plant seeds, right? We're here just to announce some good news, to get people thinking about how God might be working in a different way. They weren't worried that if the people didn't believe them, that they were going to be punished eternally, right? We have Paul's sermons. He doesn't say anything about that when he's preaching to them. What he wants to do is invite them into a fuller, richer experience of God. For those who are religious, they said there's something missing. There's still something missing. This is a way to find a completeness, what God is continuing to do, that faith is more than following rules. And that's what Paul comes and brings to the people. But if they're not ready to hear that, he says, all right, I'll go to the next town. I'll introduce this idea, and we'll come back later, all right? So they moved to the next town. They would go to Lystra, 25 miles down the road. But they don't have the same problem when they get there. They have a different problem. When we get to this part of Acts, there's no mention of visiting a synagogue. That was their style. They come to a town, they go to the synagogue, they find people who are Jewish, who already know about God, and they talk about a new way of understanding who God is. But now, they've got a different problem. There must have been a few people in Lystra, because it's the hometown of someone named Timothy. And we hear about Timothy later in the Bible, but we don't hear about it, not in Acts, so it's going to come up a little bit later. But Paul is planting seeds that will take many years to grow. Timothy's mother and grandmother will come to faith by the process of Paul's visit there, and they will teach it to their child, Timothy. And when Paul comes back many years later through the same area, he's going to invite Timothy to join him in ministry. And there's a book of the Bible written about one of the letters he writes to Timothy. We can read that. Part of this. Let me just read this a little bit from his letter to Timothy. Paul writes this to Timothy when Timothy is older. He says, "You've observed my teachings, my conduct, my faith, my patience, my love, my steadfastness, my persecutions, my sufferings, all the things that happened to me in Antioch, in Iconium, and in Lystra." It's wonderful that we have these letters that help support and help us understand the book of Acts. We've been hearing readings from the book of Galatians for the last 5 weeks. And the cities of Iconium and Antioch and Lystra are Galatia. So when he writes a letter to the Galatians, these are the people that he's writing to. But let's go back to the book of Acts. As I mentioned, the situation in Lystra was different. In Antioch or Iconium, he could go to the synagogue, share the heritage, talk about Jesus being the promised Messiah. People knew something of that. But that's not going to work when you don't have a Jewish population. The first thing you see when you come into Lystra is a large temple to Zeus. All right? The Greeks believed in a whole pantheon full of gods that governed different aspects of life. And the gods would marry each other, and some had kids, and they would fight with each other, and they got jealous, and they played tricks, and sometimes they would come down and visit mortals. And so this was sort of their belief system, sort of these superheroes, if you will, that they had. And the tradition that they believed was just that Zeus and one of his sons named Hermes had come down from Mount Olympus and had brought a message to them. They had come and visited, and those who showed them hospitality they blessed, and those who did not show them hospitality they cursed. And so in honor of this old tradition they had of the gods visiting them, they built this temple to Zeus. And so that was the main thing you saw when you came into Lystra. All right, so a little background just so you know the setting he's coming into. All right, in Lystra, let's go back to the scripture here. In Lystra, a man was sitting who could not use his feet, had never walked, for he'd been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked at him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed. I'm not exactly sure what that means. He had faith to be healed. What did this man have faith in? He hadn't never heard of Jesus. He couldn't have had faith in Jesus. Did he have faith in Paul? Doesn't say he had enough faith. He simply says Paul saw in this person, I don't know, receptivity maybe, be able to experience, someone who could experience faith. So Paul says to him in a loud voice, it says, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in their language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and he and the crowds wanted to offer a sacrifice. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their clothes, they rushed into the crowd saying, "Friends, why are you doing this? We are just mortals like you. We simply come to bring good news. We should turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all nations to follow their own ways, yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling you with food and hearts with joy." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. I don't know if you've ever had that happen. I mean, not people bowing down thinking you're God, but thinking you were crystal clear on what you were saying, have someone making an assumption and messing the whole thing up, right? So that's what happens here. A whole new problem than they've had in other towns they went to. Different gods that they were dealing with, different misunderstandings. But their old enemies eventually catch up with them. All right, let's go back to Acts. It says, "But the Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium and won over the crowds. And they stoned Paul, and they dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples surrounded him, he got up, went into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas went on to Derbe." You'd think that almost getting stoned to death would get you a day off, but it doesn't. All right. Discouraging results don't seem to discourage Paul and Barnabas. Everywhere they had gone, they got run out of town or almost killed or put in prison. Paul says, "I got a great idea. Let's go back and visit all those places." All right? And so after they proclaimed the good news in the city, they had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, and then on to Iconium, and then on to Antioch. There they strengthened the souls of the disciples, encouraged them to continue in the faith, saying, "It's through many persecutions that we enter the kingdom of God." And after they appointed elders for each church, with prayer and fasting, they entrusted to them into the Lord in whom they had come to believe. Then they passed through Pisidia, came down through Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word in Perga, they went to Attalia. And from there they sailed back to Antioch, where they commended to the grace of God for the work that they had completed. And when they arrived, they called the church together and related all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there with the disciples for some time. Now, the success that Paul and Barnabas creates a crisis, though, for the church. When you had Jewish people who were already accepting Jesus as Messiah, you had people who already were living according to God's law and lifestyle. There was a certain lifestyle that was attractive because of a high morality that was involved with that tradition. When you start bringing in Gentiles wholesale, you're bringing all kinds of different cultural norms. And it's going to change dramatically what the church looks like. So I had this problem. How are they going to add in all this diversity and still keep what is essential? It's a big issue for them. If you want to find out how they did that, you're going to have to come back on Wednesday. Or you can read it for yourself in Acts 15. All right, the story continues, and it creates this big crisis, which is another one of these turning points in the book of Acts. All right, so let's get musicians back up here. The story continues next week as we continue this. We've got about 6 more weeks here, and we're going to get ourselves through this book of Acts. We have a little guide in the back of the church, a reading guide, if you want to know what we're reading each week and catch up or look ahead to what's coming. I invite you to do that as well. We have a song